She was the daughter of two of the most perfect people ever created. Her mother was the second most perfect woman created, only second to Mary, the mother of Jesus. And her father was none other than the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam himself. Join Sunnahfollowers online as Ustada lailanasheeba takes us on the journey of the woman known as Fatimah, the daughter of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We're ready to begin. Inna alhamdulillah wa salat wa salam ala wa rasulullah. Welcome to our series entitled The Heroines of Islam. The Heroines of Islam. And this series is all about teaching you about the female companions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And this class is very important because this class will put to rest many misconceptions that we have as Muslims and non-Muslims about the role of women in Islam. As you guys have seen from me doing the wives of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the women in Islam never took a back seat. Muslim women have never been ignored and unnoticed. And this is something that bothers me because we'll hear a lot of male daya today try to tell women in the West they don't do this to their own women, the women in the East, because the Muslim women in the Muslim countries, they know what their roles and their rights are as women. And they know their history. They know that Arabic women have never been back shelved. It's not in their culture. Shelf a woman. And what do I mean by back shelf? That means put her on a back shelf and make it like she's invisible, like she doesn't exist. No. As you guys will see from this series, you know, the Muslim women have played an active role in the advent of Islam. From the beginning of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam's prophethood to his death, and even through the caliphs, the caliphate of Abu Bakr, the caliphate of Umar, Uthman, Ali, the Muslim women have always played a role. They were never put on a back shelter. They were never told to be invisible. They were very active. They were not only active on the battlefield, but they were active in teaching Islam. They were active in issuing fatwa about Islam. Salama issued fatwa. Aisha radiallahu anha issued fatwa. Hafsa issued fatwa. So I don't know where these misconceptions about the role of women in Islam come from, but the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam said it would be one of the signs of the last hour. One of the signs of the last hour, just like the war that's beginning, that started up in Palestine. That's one of the signs. Well, the Prophet also said another one of the signs of the last hour is that women, the rights of women will become stripped away to the point where they will be like they were before Islam. They'll be making tawaf around the Kaaba even naked. Subhanallah. So I'm not surprised that these misconceptions exist, but what does behoove me is the fact that so many Muslim women allow these uneducated men to fill your heads with these misconceptions. You women don't take the initiative to study and learn the truth about your role as a woman. So that's why I'm teaching about the female companions, because just as you guys have discovered, the Prophet's wives, they did not take a back seat. They were not on the back burner. The Khadijah, radiallahu anha, was with the Prophet Muhammad from the beginning of his mission until her death. She was his biggest supporter. She was also his greatest protector. Okay? And we're going to discover her daughter, their daughter, Fatima, radiallahu anha. She took on the banner. After her mother died, she picked up the banner in defending her father. And she was active with him. She was not invisible. And also the women, the female companions, not only were they visible physically, but they were visible verbally too. You'll find a lot of Muslim men today telling you that the woman's voice is aura. This is not true. This is not correct. The woman's voice is not part of her nakedness. If it were, then Allah wouldn't have given us a tongue and a mouth to speak with, number one. Number two, you wouldn't have any hadiths narrated by any female companion if a woman's voice was aura, because that would mean that no woman companion, no female would be able to speak publicly. Okay, so the woman's voice is not aura. And as you guys have discovered, when I did the story of the wives of the prophets, they had a great voice. Aisha was one of the first scholars of Islam. Salama was a woman that no man, not even Umar radiallahu anha, would dare cross paths with. She spoke. She checked Umar. When Umar entered into the home of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and admonished the Prophet's wives for the way they were treating him, Salama was the one that stepped forward and said, Umar, what makes you think that you can dip your nose in the business of what happens in the house of the Prophet? She was the one that corrected Umar, checked him, and he shut up and he left out the door. Didn't give her no back talk. Nobody talked back to Salama. We did her story. She was feared because she was a woman that was very intimidating, because she was a warrior. Her first cousin was Khalid bin Walid, and she was just as trained as he was, if not more so, in warfare and strategy. Okay, so the Prophet's wives all had a voice, and they spoke out publicly, where you're going to discover today in the story of his daughter Fatima that she too had a voice and she too spoke out publicly. But there are guidelines that Allah gives the believing woman. Allah does not forbid the believing woman from having a voice. But what Allah commands the believing woman is that when we do speak, we speak in a strong voice like I'm using. Allah commands us in the Quran, do not soften your voices publicly. And this is what I see a lot of Muslim women doing, which is haram. They'll get on the microphone on social platforms and make their voices real soft like babies. This is forbidden. This is haram. My Arabic sisters are big on that. They all get on the mic and they all sound like 10-year-old little girls. Astaghfirullah. Allah commands the believing woman to make her voice strong and deep, not soft, when she speaks publicly. All the Prophet's wives had strong, loud voices like mine. And you're going to discover today that including his daughter Fatima, she spoke publicly, but she had a strong, loud, intimidating voice too. Intimidation. This is a quality that women had to have back in the medieval period to survive. Intimidation. This is a quality that we need even today. Because a woman that can't intimidate, this is a woman that oftentimes ends up taken advantage of. So with that said, I'm going to begin the story of Fatima radiallahu anha, who was the daughter of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And let me put the PowerPoint up on the screen so everyone can see. Oh, there it is. I had to find it. Okay, inshallah, you guys can see it. And again, all the information that I am giving you is authentic. Most of it is from Sahih Bukhari and Sahih Muslim. So tonight we're going to be discussing the story of Fatima, the daughter of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And tonight I'm going to do the first part of her story. I divided her story up into two parts. The first part will speak about her youth. And let's begin and look and see about her youth. First of all, Fatima was the fifth child of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and Khadijah. She was born at a time when her father had begun to spend long periods of time in the mountains around Mecca, meditating and reflecting on Allah's creation. And this was before, close it, my grandkids. This was before the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam received the call to prophethood. Okay? Her eldest sister, Zainab, was married to their cousin, a man named Al-As ibn Rabia. And then after she married her other two sisters, Ruqayya and Kulthum, they too got married. They married the sons of Abu Lahab, who was also one of their relatives. And both Abu Lahab and his wife named Jamil turned out to be enemies to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But we'll get to that in a minute. But here we can see Fatima radiallahu anha was born the fifth child of the Prophet and Khadijah. She was the youngest of the daughters. Her older daughters married when she was very young. And so little Fatima, when she was around perhaps 5 years old or less, she saw her sisters leave home one after the other to take on the role of a wife. And she was too young to understand the meaning of what marriage was. And also she was too young to understand why her sisters had to leave the home. She was very close to her sisters. And when they left, she was very lonely and she was very sad. It is said in an authentic hadith that a certain silence and a painful sadness overcame her when she realized that all of her sisters had left home. But even though her sisters had left home, she was not alone. Remember Barakah, who was the woman who raised the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, lived with her and her mother and father. And also Khadijah had given Zayd ibn Haritha as a slave to the Prophet, and the Prophet had adopted him as a son. He lived with them too. And also Ali radiallahu anhu, who was one of the youngest sons of Abu Talib, and he was 2 years older than Fatima. He lived with them too. So she had other children to play with in the home, but she was very attached to her sisters and still suffered a great sadness that they left home. Her mother and Barakah realized how lonely Fatima was, and they spent a lot of time with her. Khadijah radiallahu anha tried to make her comfortable. Barakah tried to make her comfortable. And Ali, he acted like a brother to her. He was 2 years older than her, and he became a brother and a friend to her. He tried to replace her own brother who had died as a baby. His name was El Qasim. He was the oldest. And also there was another brother who was born after her. Khadijah got pregnant. Her mother Khadijah got pregnant with another child after her, but he died as a baby too. So Ali became a close friend and like a brother to her. But still, nobody could replace her sisters. They say that Fatima was a very sensitive child for her age. When she was 5 years old, that's when her father had become a prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And her father's first job was to convey the news of Islam to his family and his close relatives. Remember, Islam teaches us that charity begins at home. Islam teaches us that before we go out to help others or to call others to the truth, we have to begin with our family first. Save your family from the hellfire. So the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was told to convey the good news of Islam to his family and relatives first. They were to worship Allah alone. And her mother, who was a tower of strength and support, was one of the first to convert to this new religion. And she explained to Fatima what her father had to do. She was one that explained to Fatima that her father was a prophet, a messenger, and had to do the call of Allah. And when her mother explained this to her, that's when Fatima, even though she was 5 years old, she became even more closely attached to her father because she wanted to help him. You know, what little girl is not attached to her father? She would attend with him the Kaaba. She would go to the secret gatherings that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam had to speak about Islam. She tagged along with him. Okay. One day, before she was even the age of 10, she went with her father to the Masjid al-Haram. And her father stood facing the Kaaba and he began to pray. Fatima was standing at his side and a group of Quraysh men gathered around them. And those men included Abu Jahl. They began to make fun of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And one of them even said, which one of you will go and get the entrails of an animal and throw it on his back as he's prostrating? Uqba ibn Abu Mu'ayt, who was one of the worst of the group, he volunteered to do this, and he went off to find the guts of a camel. And he found the guts of a camel and threw it on the shoulders of the Prophet while he was prostrating. Ibn Masud, radiallahu anhu, who had also converted to Islam, was present, but he was not in a position to help the Prophet. So imagine how Fatima felt. She's standing right next to her father, and she sees her father treated this way. What could she do? She was only 10 years old. Well, again, to show how the Muslim women were never women that sat on the back shelf. This little child of less than 10 years old, she went up to her father and she removed the filth from off his back. And then she turned and faced the group of thugs that threw it on him, and she began to lash out at them. And they stood there and they did not even respond to what she said. And as she was lashing out at them for what they did to her father, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam raised his head and he said, "Oh Allah, may you punish the Quraysh." And he repeated this 3 times. And then he began to name them. He said, "Oh Allah, may you punish Utbah, Ukhbah, Abu Jahl, and Sheba." And all of those men who threw that filth on his back and caused his daughter to lash out at them, Allah answered his dua. They were killed years later at the Battle of Badr. So, you learn from that, guys, that sometimes, it may take a little time. When we make dua, we ask Allah, for things. A lot of people say, "Oh, it seems like Allah doesn't answer my dua." Allah will answer as long as you are patient. It took a few years, but Allah did get revenge on all of those men who tried to defile the Prophet the way they did. Sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So be patient with your supplications. Allah will eventually answer. There was also another incident when Fatima was with her father. He was again making tawaf around the Kaaba, and a group of Quraysh gathered around him, and they jumped on him and tried to strangle him with his own clothing. Fatima began to scream for help. Abu Bakr heard her screaming and rushed to the scene, and he managed to free the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And while he was removing the men off the Prophet's back, he said, "You're going to kill a man just because he believes in Allah?" And so the men stopped fighting the Prophet, and they then turned on Abu Bakr, and they beat him so bad that his head flowed and his face flowed with blood. So these are the types of scenes of oppression that Fatima had to witness as a young girl. From the age of 5 up, she witnessed many attacks that were made upon her father. And every time her father was attacked, she would join in the struggle. She would try to defend her father. So again, this is another example as to how the Muslim women did not just sit in the background. Even the young girls, they were right there in the struggle of the truth as well. Okay? Also, not only was Fatima subjected to this type of crap, but also her sisters. Ruqayya and Kulthum, they also suffered. Remember, they were the ones who had married 2 of the sons of Abu Lahab. Their husbands were the sons of Abu Lahab, and his wife was so evil. And this is why Khadijah, radiallahu anha, was opposed to her daughters marrying from Abu Lahab's family, because his wife was known for her evilness. Well, Jamil convinced her sons to divorce Ruqayya and to divorce her sister because of their faith. And of course, the Prophet didn't mind this, because guess what? In Islam, a woman cannot be married to a non-Muslim man anyway. So, but at the beckoning of their mother, they divorced the 2 daughters of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And they did this in an attempt to try to disgrace his family. Because back then, if a woman was divorced, it was meant to be a disgrace upon the family. But it was not a disgrace. It was a joy and a relief that they were released from those marriages. And their older sister, Zainab, her husband stood up against his father. When his father told him to divorce her, he refused. Even when the Quraysh came to him and promised him money and also a woman more beautiful than Zainab, he told them, "No, I love my wife deeply, and I have nothing but great and high esteem for her father. So he had refused to divorce his wife. But in the meantime, Ruqayya and Kulthum were happy to be back in their loving parents' home and to be rid of the mental abuse that they had to put up with from their husband's mother. And not long after that, Ruqayya married Uthman. You guys know who Uthman radiallahu anhu was. She ended up marrying Uthman, and they became among the first to he became among one of the first to accept Islam, and she married him, and they ended up moving to Abyssinia. Okay. And by the way, when Ruqayya married Uthman and moved to Abyssinia, Fatima never saw her again until after their mother had died. Okay? So, back to the story. The persecution of the Prophet ﷺ and his family continued and became worse each year. In the 7th year of his mission, he and his whole tribe were forced to leave their homes and seek refuge in a little valley enclosed by hills. This was the boycott that the Quraysh issued upon not just the Prophet, but also his whole tribe. Because by issuing a boycott against his whole tribe, they were hoping that this would put pressure on his non-Muslim relatives, to get him to abandon his mission. But it did not. So the Prophet ﷺ and the two clans, were forced to retire without much food or anything. Fatima was with him. In fact, she was the youngest. She was around 12 years old, and they went through months of hardship and suffering. They suffered. The children and the women could be heard crying from the hills because the Quraysh would not allow food nor any contact with them. And this boycott that the Quraysh did lasted for 3 years. And I want to point out something here. Protesting did exist back then. The Romans, the Greeks, protesting was very common back then. Even the Arabs protested. When the Arabs protested against something, they would go to the Kaaba and they would stand near the Kaaba and speak about whatever it was that they were protesting. Even though the Prophet ﷺ and his people were boycotted and pushed out to the mountains, he didn't protest. Okay? But he did not object to the non-Muslims protesting. Because when they put him and his clans and left them out in the mountains and boycotted them, the other non-Muslim tribes began to protest. They didn't agree with what the Quraysh were doing. They didn't think it was fair that the women and children were starving like that. So although the Muslims didn't protest, the Prophet did not object to the non-Muslims doing it. And they did. And that's eventually how the boycott ended, through the protests of the other non-Muslim Arabic peoples. And when the boycott was lifted, the Prophet ﷺ had to face even more trials and difficulties. Because right after the boycott ended, that's when Khadijah, the mother of Fatima, died. And when she died, this was a great tragedy. Fatima, who was now a young lady, she was 14 years old. She was greatly upset by losing her mother, and she cried. And for some time, she was so grief-stricken that her health began to deteriorate. And a lot of people believed that she would die from grief, but she didn't. Even though her older sister Kulthum stayed with her, Fatima realized that she had a greater responsibility now because she had to fill the shoes of her mother. Her mother was the greatest protection for the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So Fatima now felt it her duty, her job to step up to the plate, to support her father the way her mother did. And that's how she earned the nickname of Abiha. Habiha means the mother of her father. This was a nickname that people gave her because she stepped up to the plate and provided him comfort during his times of trial and difficulty, just as her mother would have done had she been living. But Fatima, radiallahu anha, was still a young girl. She was only 14 and she was still a woman. And oftentimes the difficulties that her father faced would become too much for her. One time, there was a mob of the Quraysh. They found her father again praying at the Kaaba. And what they did was they took a heap of dust and threw it over her father's head. And when her father came home and Fatima saw him covered in dust, she began to cry and wipe the dust away. And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam knew how upset she was. And he told her, he said, "Don't cry, my daughter, because Allah will protect me. Don't worry about me. Allah will protect me." And so this is how the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam developed that special love for Fatima. His love for her was so great that he once told her husband Ali, he said, "Whoever pleases Fatima has indeed pleased Allah, and whoever has caused her to be hurt has indeed angered Allah. Fatima is a part of me. Whatever pleases her pleases me, and whatever angers her angers me." And we're going to talk about what happened to make the Prophet say that later. We're going to talk about that next week. Something happened that caused the Prophet to say that to her husband Ali. Okay? Also, in another hadith, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said the best women in all the world are four. The first most perfect woman ever created was Mary, the mother of Jesus. And then the second woman that was most perfectly created is Asiya, the wife of Pharaoh. The third most perfect woman ever created is Khadijah, the mother of the believers. And the fourth is my daughter Fatima. And so how could she not be? Her father was the best human ever created by Allah. And her mother was the third most perfect woman ever created. So of course Fatima had no choice but to fall in that category of the most perfect women ever created by Allah. Even more perfect than Eve, radiallahu anha. Even more perfect than Sarah, the wife of Abraham. Subhanallah. Also, another nickname that Fatima radiallahu anha was given was the nickname of Az-Zahra. What does Az-Zahra mean? It means the most resplendent one. And the reason they gave her that nickname is because she had a brightness about her face. Her face was so bright and shiny. It was like the moon. They say that when she would stand to pray, the light would reflect off her face to the mihrab. Okay? So she had also the nickname Az-Zahra, which means the resplendent one. Another nickname she had was El Batul. And the reason she got that nickname was because she spent a lot of time in the company of women, a lot of time praying instead of sitting in the company of women. One of the things that women like to do is sit around and, talk and gossip. Well, Fatima didn't have time for that. In her free time, if she wasn't helping her father, and later on when she got married, if she wasn't helping her husband, she would spend her time praying or reading the Quran or doing other actions of worship. So that's how she got the nickname El Batul as well. And also, a lot of people ask, how did she look? Well, she looked exactly like her father. And we talked about the description of the prophet before. Aisha, radiallahu anha, tells us that she never saw anyone who resembled the prophet more in speech, behavior, than Fatima, radiallahu anha. Whenever the prophet saw her, he would welcome her, kiss her, and then take her by the hand and have her sit where he was sitting. And she would do the same thing to him if he came to visit her. She had the same mannerisms that the prophet had. She used to walk like him. You know how sometimes we look at our children and we can say, oh my God, you're just like your father. Or, she picks her teeth like her father. Or, she rubs her hands all the time like her mother. Well, she had a lot of the Prophet Muhammad's mannerisms. The way she walked, the way she talked. She was a very eloquent, and this is important, she was a very eloquent speaker, which is more proof that a woman's voice is not part of her aura. Okay? She was especially kind to the poor people. She would give in charity a lot. And she also didn't crave the rich things in life. She tried to emulate her father. She tried to live a life of simplicity and not rely on luxury. Okay? She inherited her father's way of speaking. Whenever Fatima would speak, the people would be moved to tears because she had the ability to shake a heart. Remember, this is what Aisha had this ability to. A woman, or a man, if you want to be a person of dawah, you have to have the ability to move a person's heart, to make a person's heart shake out of fear and also warm out of hope. Well, she was able to do that. She had the gift of eloquence of her voice. When she spoke, people would listen. If she wanted to move you to tears, she could do that. If she wanted to make you feel hopeful, she could do that. So again, when you hear these brothers tell you that as a woman, it's haram for you to speak publicly because your voice is aura, ask them, where's your dalil? There is nothing, I repeat, there is nothing, I repeat, there is no hadith or no verse of the Quran on this planet that says a woman's voice is aura. Instead, Allah tells Muslim women that when we speak publicly, to make our voices loud and strong. And that's how Aisha's voice was. That's how Fatima's voice was. That's how my voice is. That's how yours should be. That's how yours should be. Okay? So I'm going to stop right here for today. This is just the first part of the story of Fatima, of her youth. As you can see, her childhood was not spent, like so many kids today, playing Xbox, watching TV, going out to the mall, hanging out with the people and all that. Her time was spent, protecting her father, helping her father with the dawah. The Muslim children today are so privileged. They think they're so privileged. They don't have, the hardships that those children in Palestine are enduring. They don't have the hardships that the companions had growing up. So it's important for us as parents to tell these stories to our children, to share with them the story of Fatima and other companions, to see that from the age of 5 years old, they saw their parents, they endured abuse. At the age of 9, you were picking up the entrails off your father's back. The age of 12, you had to brush the dirt off your father and yell at the non-believers to leave him alone. It's important to share these stories with our kids. Okay, I'm going to stop right here. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdika ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk.